So during the 15th and 16th centuries, the Catholic Church, which was centered in Rome, really tried to maintain control of Northern Europe through teachings and art. But many people felt that the Church had too much power, too much wealth, and that they were far too lavish. This tension between Northern European territories and the Roman Catholic Church resulted in what we now know as the Protestant Reformation, which dates from about 1517 to 1658. So in 1517, Martin Luther, a German theology professor, monk, and priest, posted his 95 Theses calling for church reform. He questioned the church's acceptance of bribery to reduce the punishments for sins and the excessive veneration of saints and their relics as being superstitious. He and other reformers emphasized individual faith or personal relationships with God and challenged the supremacy of the Pope by regarding the Bible as the ultimate religious authority. In 1521, the Catholic Church condemned Luther as a heretic, but division between Catholicism and Protestantism only widens through the 16th century. Reformers utilized Gutenberg's printing press, which had been invented in about 1439, to spread their ideas to an increasingly literate population. In Germany, Luther's writings led to a break from the Catholic Church and the establishment of the Protestant or Lutheran Church. In regions where Protestantism was supreme, Catholic artists began to leave the areas to seek patronage elsewhere, and there was widespread iconoclasm, or the destruction of religious images by Protestant extremists. Artists in these areas still depict religious subject matter, but they also started to turn to secular subjects, including portraiture, landscape, travel and historical scenes, and still lifes, although they typically infuse those with moralizing messages. Altarpieces remain prominent art objects throughout the 16th century. This was commissioned for the monastery of St. Anthony in Eisenheim, France, which ran a specialized hospital for patients suffering from skin diseases, including the plague, leprosy, and St. Anthony's fire, or ergotism, which was a terrible burning rash caused by ingesting grain infected with the ergo fungus. Now, this altarpiece is somewhat unique in that it has both sculpted and painted elements created by two different artists. The sculptor is Niklaus Hagener. He was from Strasbourg, and he carved the original altarpiece for Eisenheim in about 1505. Then, in about 1510, Matthias Grunewald painted one set of fixed wings, two sets of movable ones, and one set of panels for the predella. The altarpiece can be displayed in different configurations depending on the church calendar. The painted wings both protect and complement the sculpture within, which in turn helps to bring the paintings to life. So this work really sort of combines medieval mysticism and emotional spirituality with the newfound philosophy of humanism. So this is what the altarpiece would look like on weekdays when it's closed. It features a painted crucifixion scene. We have Christ shown on the cross. He's sort of larger than life, and his rather gaunt body is covered in these bloody, oozing sores. And then notice the fingers on his hands are sort of splayed outwards, and his feet are sort of bent inwards, communicating this real sense of pain. We have Mary Magdalene kneeling next to the cross, lamenting, and then behind her we have this depiction of the swooning Virgin Mary being supported by John the Evangelist. Now over here on the other side, we have John the Baptist kind of standing and pointing at the cross, and then next to him we have a sacrificial lamb. Below, in the base or the predella, we have a sort of lamentation or entombment scene. And Mary and others are sort of grieving over the dead body of Christ, which again is covered in these oozing sores. And then in the fixed wings, we have depictions of Saints Sebastian and Anthony. Anthony is the patron saint of this monastery and of those suffering from skin diseases, and both Anthony and Sebastian are associated with the plague. So the intensity of emotion here, as well as the rather morbid treatment of of Christ's body are meant to be something for the patients at this hospital to kind of resonate with and to find comfort in, kind of knowing that they were not alone in their pain and suffering. Here's a detail of that Prodea panel to really sort of emphasize the emotionality and humanistic treatment of these scenes. Each of the figures kind of weeps over the dead body of Christ as they prepare him for burial. And Grunewald has really tried to capture this rather grotesque quality of a deceased body, especially one with these bloody lesions and kind of broken bones. He's kind of emphasizing the physical suffering and then the subsequent emotional suffering as well. Now, on Sundays and feast days, the altarpiece would be opened to reveal a much more joyous set of subjects. We have the Annunciation over here in the left wing. We have a central nativity scene, which features this angelic choir playing for the Madonna and Child. And then over here in the right wing, we have kind of this triumphant scene of Christ's resurrection. All three panels have this sort of visionary glow, which is creating kind of a hallucinatory experience. Now, this is likely that medieval emphasis on the mystical and otherworldly sort of shining through. However, the ergo fungus not only caused the horrible skin lesions of St. Anthony's fire, it also often caused hallucinations, and later it would be used to make LSD. So perhaps Grunewald is kind of referencing that symptom of that particular disease. But I think either way, the kind of glowing depiction kind of adds to the sense of euphoria across these scenes. For special occasions, like the Feast of St. Anthony, the altarpiece could be fully opened to reveal Hagenauer's symmetrical and logically sculpted wooden altar, with St. Anthony in the center, and he is flanked then by Saints Jerome and St. Augustine. In the Prodea, we have Christ, who appears in the center with 6 apostles in these small niches to either side of him. And in the final set of painted wings, Grunewald depicts over here on the left St. Anthony visiting with the hermit St. Paul in the wilderness, which is sort of meant to glorify monastic life. And then on the right, we have St. Anthony being tempted and tormented by demons in the desert, which is maybe another reference to the horrors that these patients in the hospital would have experienced. However, it's also a reference to a very well-known print by Nikolaus Hagenauer. And then here's an image to sort of give you a sense of the scale of this altarpiece. It's really quite large, so you can sort of see the details quite clearly, and you're truly enveloped by these scenes. The leading artist of the German Renaissance was Albrecht Dürer from Nuremberg, who was trained in goldworking, stained glass design, painting, and printmaking. In the 1490s, he traveled Europe to extend his education, and in 1494 and 95, he traveled to Italy, where he was introduced to the ideas and attitudes of the Italian Renaissance. So here we have a self-portrait from right around 1500, in which Dürer sort of presents himself in this severely frontal pose, staring rather confidently at the viewer. There's not much emotional expression within his face. It's quite still and reserved. And we seem to have sort of this focus on the eyes and then again on the hands, both of which are the tools of an artist. And Dürer is really sort of expressing this northern interest in detail and clarity. However, he's clearly studied in the South or in Italy. Notice the really meticulous attention to detail in the surface textures. We have sort of the soft sheen of human flesh, the reflective wetness of the eyes, and the tactile quality of the hair, both in his kind of beard and his curly hair, as well as the sort of fur that trims his cloak here. And then notice how the figure's hand sort of strokes that soft fur, kind of encouraging viewers to imagine the way it feels based on what they see. We do have this stable kind of triangular composition, which is consistent with the high Renaissance ideals of harmony and balance. And Durer has also used a very sort of delicate chiaroscuro to model the figure. Now, it's not unusual for an artist to make a self-portrait, but this one is somewhat unusual with its extreme kind of frontal view, which at the time was generally reserved for iconic images of Christ. Now, it's possible that Durer was purposefully trying to reference these depictions of Christ. He could have been referring to the idea that humans are created in the image of God, or the belief that humans are meant to imitate Christ within their own lives. Or perhaps he was claiming the importance of the artist, not just as a skilled craftsman, but as a learned individual and creative genius, or even as a divinely inspired creator with exceptional God-given talents. So, when Durer returned to Germany, he began publishing his own prints as a source of income. By the end of the 14th century, with the development of the printing press and the increased manufacture and availability of paper, printmaking could now be fully utilized as an artistic medium. One prominent technique used by printmakers during the 15th and 16th centuries was woodcut. Woodcuts are made by drawing on the surface of a wood block, then cutting away the material around the lines, leaving a high relief carving, which can then be inked and printed to transfer the relief areas onto paper and create a reverse image. Durer's first major publication, titled The Apocalypse, appeared in 1497 and 98 and consisted of a woodcut title page and 14 full-page woodcut illustrations with text printed on the back. The most well-known of these depicts the four horsemen of the apocalypse, based on figures described in the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. We have a crowned rider with a bow on a white horse. This represents conquest. Then we have a rider with a sword on a red horse, which is war. A third rider with a set of scales is on a black horse. This represents plague and famine. And lastly, we have a skeletal rider on a sort of pale, sickly horse, and this represents death. Now, in the past, artists typically placed the four horsemen in an orderly line across the landscape, but Durer has really injected motion and danger into this traditionally solemn scene. His figures overlap one another to form this sort of compact group of wild riders that charges furiously across the landscape and tramples anyone in their path. Notice down here at the bottom of the composition, we have Death on his pale horse, and he is sweeping both peasants and royalty back here into the jaws of Hades. Now, Durer probably did not carve his own woodblocks, but rather he employed skilled carvers to follow his drawings very closely. He incorporates complex patterns to model the forms using only lines. Notice how he uses both short and then long lines that are parallel with one another to sort of imply areas of darker value. And the closer the lines are together, the darker the value seems to be. This is a technique called hatching. Durer also utilized another printmaking method, engraving on metal. This requires a technique called intaglio, which comes from the Italian word intagliare, meaning to cut into. Artists push sharp tools called burins across the metal print plate to cut or gouge their lines into the surface. Now, this is not free drawing, but a very careful and precise creation of lines. However, you can achieve quite fine details. Applying more pressure to the burin pushes it deeper and creates thicker, darker lines. But once the artist is satisfied, they polish the plate to ensure a clear, crisp image. Ink is then applied over the entire plate surface and forced down into the lines before the excess ink is carefully wiped away. The plate is then tightly pressed to paper using a press, and the ink in the recessed lines transfers to the paper. This 1504 engraving of Adam and Eve really reflects Durer's growing interest in Italian art and his study of the natural world, as well as other theoretical investigations. This is also the first documentation of Durer's use of ideal human proportions based on ancient Greek and Roman works. He would have seen contemporary examples on his trip to Italy, and he would have been familiar with ancient sculptures from prints and drawings. So Adam and Eve here are both depicted as these very sort of classically heroic nudes standing in contrapposto. Their bodies are frontal, but notice their faces are sort of in profile as they turn towards one another and towards temptation as the serpent between them kind of offers them the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Now, this sort of activates the scene, implying that the figures are interacting with one another and the world that they occupy, but it also conforms to the idea that a profile view was the most noble way to depict an important person, which is something that has been prominent in art since antiquity and throughout the medieval era. Now, notice how these very classically idealized figures are surrounded by this very traditionally northern attention to detail in the sort of landscape and the foliage and animal life here in the background. Um, Keep in mind that in order to create these areas of very dark value, um, through the process of engraving, the artist needs to really scratch up the surface of the print plate. So Durer here has very meticulously kind of rendered the figures and the scene by carefully arranging these various small lines next to and across one another in techniques of both hatching and cross hatching. We also seem to have sort of a northern sense of modesty with these leaves covering some of the nudity of Adam and Eve as well. And then, in a pretty traditional northern fashion, Durer has also infused the landscape with symbolic content to enhance the message of his composition. He's referencing the medieval belief that imbalances of bodily fluids could affect human temperaments or personalities. For example, an excess of black bile in the liver could cause feelings of melancholy, despair, or greed. And here, that is symbolized by the elk. Yellow bile could cause anger, pride, and impatience, which is represented with this cat here in the foreground. Um, Phlegm in the lungs could cause lethargy and apathy, which is symbolized by the ox in the background here. And an excess of blood made a person optimistic, but also compulsively interested in pleasures of the flesh, which is symbolized by the presence of this rabbit. We also see this mouse, kind of over here to the left, which symbolizes Satan, whose earthly power is already manifest in the garden here through the serpent. Notice that Adam kind of stands on the mouse's tail, hearkening back to the parallel between Adam and Christ and St. Augustine's description of the cross as the devil's mousetrap. However, also notice that as Adam kind of contemplates and moves towards the forbidden fruit, he's leaning forward, and it seems that he's about to release the mouse and thus Satan into the world. Um, Lastly, we have up in the top right corner, kind of far in the distance, we can see this little ibex kind of teetering on the edge of this cliff, sort of similar to the way that Adam and Eve are teetering on the edge of sin here. Um, Also, now lastly, one more thing. Adam kind of grasps this tree branch here. We have a parrot perched on the tree branch, which some have interpreted as symbolizing false wisdom because parrots tend to only repeat what they hear. And then hanging from that branch, we have this rather prominent kind of placard that includes the artist's signature and the date. So, despite the opposition of their Spanish rulers, Protestant Reformation still really took hold within the northern provinces of the Netherlands during the 16th century. Widespread iconoclasm, religious persecution, economic hardship, and inadequate governance characterized this region. The long battle for independence began in 1568 and lasted for about 80 years until Spain had relinquished all of their claims to land in this area. Um, so in the 1570s, the Netherlands was sort of split along religious lines, with the 7 northern Protestant provinces declaring themselves the United Provinces, and this is what makes up the Netherlands today. And then Catholic Flanders um, was sort of still under Spanish control, and this is what is now Belgium. But despite all of this turmoil, Antwerp and other cities developed into flourishing artistic centers. Artists did seek patronage outside the church, and small secular works, including landscape and satire paintings, wood sculptures, ceramics, prints, and textiles, became quite popular. One of the most intriguing Netherlandish painters of this time is Hieronymus Bosch. He is known for his fantastically imaginative scenes and creatures, which are depicted with very rich colors and extreme virtuosity. He often depicts a variety of subjects, and this is sort of a testament to his education, although his Catholic religious devotion is often made clear through biblical or moralizing parables. Yet his paintings are also often quite challenging and even unsettling in some cases. So here we have his Garden of Earthly Delights from about 1505 to 1515, and this is one of his best known and most challenging works. It is in a triptych kind of altarpiece format, though it was commissioned by a private patron, an aristocrat, probably Count Hendrik III of Nassau, for his Brussels townhouse. So it was not commissioned for a church. The subject matter does seem to deal with Christian beliefs on human sinfulness within the world, however, and each panel depicts this vast, brightly colored landscape populated with very active figures, strange creatures, and objects, and then the overall composition seemingly sort of reflects the progression of humanity from creation through the sins of worldly pleasure and on to the subsequent punishment of those sins. So over here in the left wing, we see the Garden of Eden, in which God introduces the newly created Adam and Eve. And then around them, we have these various creatures that kind of roam about and emerge from this hole in the foreground. So this scene kind of sets things in motion, and it prefigures all of the worldly sins. Your book notes that back here in the pool or the pond, we have this kind of strange, fantastical pink fountain. And your book kind of points out that within the opening there, we have an owl kind of peeking out. This is the owl of wisdom and folly, and its inclusion symbolizes the contemporary belief that people would choose to follow the right path once they'd been properly educated. So perhaps Bosch is sort of seeking to properly educate the viewer on the follies of sin and worldly pleasures in hopes that they will follow the true path of God. Now, in the central panel, the scene is really full of movement. The earth has become overrun by monsters, but also vivacious humans who are behaving without shame and sort of reveling in acts of sexual abandon. We have rather seductive and lusty figures kind of playing within this landscape. And then we also have these huge fruits that are sprinkled within the landscape, which can be interpreted as symbols of sex and fertility. Perhaps the message here is that life is fleeting. One 17th century scholar wrote this triptych is representing, quote, vanity and glory and the passing taste of strawberries that is hardly remembered once it has passed. Now, some argue that we have sort of a depiction of seductive women kind of back here frolicking in this pool, and then we have these sex obsessed men who are riding horses and creatures and sort of dancing around in a circle around the pool in an attempt to attract the women's attention. Maybe this is a social critique. Maybe Bosch is sort of depicting a very satirical scene of indulgent consumption by the aristocracy. But some scholars argue that the scene depicts what paradise might have been like if Adam and Eve had never sinned in the first place. One scholar has even argued that this essential panel, especially, presents a parable of human salvation in which alchemy, which is the process that sought to transform common metals into gold, is meant to sort of parallel Christ's power to convert human scum into spiritual gold. And so, in this theory, these odd kind of bulbous blue and pink fountain-like structures are read as alchemical mixing chambers. Now, in the last panel on the right here, we have this dark, flaming scene of hell where the sensual pleasures like eating, drinking, dancing, all of these things have now been turned into torturous punishments for sin and depravity. So here we have a couple of details from that hell panel. These ears that seem to be carrying a knife have been interpreted as representing the deceptive lure of the senses. And in the sort of foreground of the panel, we see we see this demon-like creature who is devouring human souls and excreting them at the same time. And then we also have this strange sort of skull or maybe shell-like body that's being inhabited by smaller figures. And then it also has a face of its own that kind of twists to look out at the viewer, which some claim that this is a self-portrait of Hieronymus Bosch. But, you know, the sort of emphasis on the torments of hell here in this panel, with really no hint of the rewards of heaven, this seems to caution the viewer that damnation is the natural outcome of a life lived in ignorant folly, and that humans ensure their damnation through their self-centered pursuits of pleasure. Now, enclosed, the exterior of Bosch's altarpiece depicts a grisaille or grayscale scene that provides a nice contrast with the interior. The scene includes this sort of floating, transparent sphere that encloses this flat, shelf-like space of Earth on the third day of creation. We have sort of this sparse landscape with pieces of half-formed fruit kind of floating within the waters here. And then this is all situated under these rather dark clouds that seem to promise some nurturing rain. Up here in the top corner, we have a small figure of God who is crowned. He kind of sits here holding a book open. This is probably meant to be a Bible, and it displays words from Psalm chapter 33, verse 9, which are sort of inscribed across the top of the panels here. It says, "For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm." So, much like Hieronymus Bosch, Peter Bruegel the Elder often painted large, multi-figured narrative works with moralizing or satirical messages. He traveled throughout Italy, but he was really more interested in the landscape, particularly the jagged rocks and sort of sweeping panoramic views of the Alpine Valley region, than he was the ruins of ancient Rome. So when he returned home, he created these rather impressive sort of composite landscapes, which present the flat, rolling Flemish countryside as having these broad panoramic landscapes with imaginary mountains and sort of jagged, rocky outcroppings in the distance. Now, during his travels, he also sketched farmers and townspeople, and later these became the focus of his paintings. However, Bruegel's humans are not necessarily unique individuals. However, they're more of generalized types, and their universality kind of makes them familiar and relatable to most viewers. Now, in this period of time, series or cycles of paintings that were unified by an overall theme or allegorical subject were quite popular, especially as decorations in wealthy Flemish households. So in 1565, Bruegel was commissioned to paint a series of 6 large compositions, each over 5 feet wide, depicting the different months of the year. And each composition was to depict 2 months of the year. Now, these were meant to be hung together, probably in a dining room, because food or food sources seem to be the prominent subjects of each panel. So here we have a scene titled Return of the Hunters, which represents the months of December and January. And Bruegel has given us this very careful sort of rhythmic composition, which really captures the bleak, frozen winter scene that is actually being warmed by the humanity within. We have these men and their dogs returning from their hunt with a rather meager catch. We just have um, one little fox kind of slung over this man's shoulder here. Notice how their heads are sort of hanging down and their steps seem to be very heavy. All of this really conveys the sort of sense of hardship of winter. Other winter activities kind of happen in the background. We have over here people tending to a fire and roasting a pig in front of these houses. In the background, we have people ice skating on these frozen fields. And then down here in the foreground, we have what seems to be a child pulling another child on a sled. And we see all this from this very sort of elevated, almost bird's eye point of view. Um, the landscape, though, really dominates the entire composition, and it sort of seems to be the primary subject. On the left, with these men, we have kind of this receding row of trees that pulls us back into the space, and it sort of descends along the same diagonal line as these hills or excuse me, these houses along the hill line there. And we can sort of trace this all the way back through the landscape on and up into these mountains. Now, the mood is very different in this painting, which is titled The Harvesters and represents the months of August and September. So, again, we have a sort of slice of everyday life being presented in a very carefully arranged composition and with a great attention to the lush landscape. So here the light is much warmer and the scene is full of human activity centering on agricultural labor or perhaps a sort of momentary break from it. We have farmers harvesting their crops and sort of gathering the grain into these tidy little piles. In the background to the right back here, we have men in the tree that are harvesting the fruit, which is probably pears, and they're tossing the fruits kind of down to the ground for people to collect in baskets. But the focus is really on the foreground with this group of workers to the right who seem to be resting on their lunch break. They sort of eat and drink, and one guy even takes a quick nap at the base of the tree. But we already have another set of workers kind of out in the field getting things done. Again, the landscape does seem to be kind of the primary subject of the scene, and this is maybe a more realistic representation of the sort of Flemish countryside. So now we'll move over to England just briefly. So the English Tudor dynasty began first in 1485 with Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, who strengthened the country's economy and reformed society. His son, Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547, was initially, loyal to the Catholic Church, and he defended it against Martin Luther's attacks. However, after the church denied him an annulment in his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church in 1534, leading to the establishment of the Church of England. Now, in spite of this disruption, the English court was economically and politically sound enough to support the arts, and in the 16th century we see somewhat of an English Renaissance in which music, literature, theater, and architecture really flourish. However, the visual arts were largely left to foreigners, painting specifically. Artists were often imported to work within the English courts and for the upper classes. And again, paintings and other visual artworks were sort of promoted as a way to sort of showcase aristocratic culture. The Tudors had favored Netherlandish and German artists for quite a while, so it's not really that surprising that this artist, Hans Holbein the Younger, who was German-born, was very important to developing the tastes of English aristocrats and royals. Now, Holbein initially visited London in 1526 to 28, but he returned in 1532 when he was appointed as King Henry VIII's court painter. During his service, he created many portraits of nobles and diplomats, and he really captured the sort of international climate of the Tudor court. So this work, which is titled The Ambassadors from 1533, really depicts Holbein's technical skill as a painter and his ability to portray complex characters and compositions with an extreme level of naturalistic detail. This double portrait, created by a German painter while working in England, actually depicts two French diplomats. We have Jean de Dentville, which is the French ambassador to England, and then his friend, the Bishop Georges de Selve, who was an ambassador to the Holy See within the court of Francis I in the Vatican. Now, notice how the artist sort of concentrates on describing the textures and the luminosity of the many objects within the painting. It's very northern in style, but the artist has also brought in that northern love of symbolism. The shelves between these two men are full of both religious and secular items that are meant to reference the intellect and accomplishments of the men, as well as the ongoing conflict between England and the Catholic Church. And there's this sort of implication that these young, confident ambassadors will apply their diplomatic skills and find a resolution to the problem. So down here on the bottom shelf, we see a globe kind of toward the back, which is turned so that Rome, the hub of the Catholic faith, is front and center. And then we have kind of this open hymn book, which displays verses written by Martin Luther, the German pioneer of Protestantism. And then nearby, we have a lute. Music in this period was commonly used as a symbol for harmony. However, the lute here actually has a broken string, so we can kind of understand it as an allusion to the religious discord across Europe during this period. Now, up here on the top shelf, we have devices that are used to sort of understand the heavens and measure time, including a celestial globe, a sundial, and several compasses. Now, for this reason, the upper shelf is often interpreted as symbolizing the heavenly or spiritual realm, while the lower shelf sort of relates more closely to earthly concerns. Now, these objects up here also sort of indicate that these men are very learned and well-traveled as ambassadors. The sundial is showing the date April 11th, 1533, which was the date this painting was completed. And then this globe over here has the de Dentville family estate marked in the middle, which is where this painting was hung upon its completion. Now down here on the floor in front of the shelves, which the floor itself is actually designed after the floor in Westminster Abbey. But we have this sort of large, strange, yet prominently placed skull. Now, this is sort of meant as a memento mori, or a symbolic reminder of human mortality. The viewers, when they see it, they are reminded of their own mortality, but it also sort of communicates that despite the wealth and success of these two young ambassadors, they're very well aware that life is fleeting. Now this skull is sort of distorted, it's kind of tilted upwards, and it's actually been put through a process called anamorphosis, which is kind of implying that it's been stretched according to this trapezoidal grid. But the result is an image that must be viewed from the side to sort of look proportionally correct. So the skull really only looks realistic if the viewer is standing at a certain point directly in front of and kind of to the side of the canvas. Also note that the skull is kind of tilted up and away from all of these worldly possessions. And if we sort of follow this line from the eyes of the skull up and across this man, kind of up to the top corner here, we see that it's pointed towards this very small, almost hidden crucifix that hangs on the wall, which this is probably meant to sort of affirm that these men believe that their salvation, their eternal life, is dependent on God, not their material accomplishments. Now let's move over to Spain just ever so briefly. The 16th century really saw the peak of Spanish political power. The country had been unified in the 15th century through the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their grandson, Charles V, abdicated in 1556, and his son, Philip II, became the king of Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, the Americas, and the ruler of the Burgundy region in what is now France, as well as some parts of what is now Italy, including Milan and Naples. Now, Philip's permanent residence was in Spain. However, he supported artists from various regions within and on the outside of his empire. The most famous painter working in Spain in the last quarter of the 16th century was Dominicos Theotokopoulos, or El Greco, which was his nickname, which means the Greek. Now, he was originally from Crete, and he had trained as a Byzantine icon painter. He then lived in Italy for about 10 years, where he studied under artists like Titian and Tintoretto, before arriving in Spain in 1577. He joined a group of humanist scholars in Toledo, where he wrote that the artist's goal should be to copy nature, not to rely so much on antiquity or mathematics to achieve ideal proportions. An intense religious revival was underway in Spain at this time, and that resulted in what is often referred to as Spanish mysticism, which is sort of the idea that kind of emphasized the mystical communion with Christ through miraculous events and visions. Now, El Greco's style was largely rooted in Byzantine icon painting, yet it really reflected the rich colors and kind of loose brushwork of the Venetian style of painting, and this made him particularly well equipped to express this intense spirituality. Now, this particular altarpiece, which is titled The Burial of Count Orgaz, is from 1586. It was commissioned by a priest for the church of Santo Tome to honor Count Orgaz, a great benefactor of the church. The story was that at the Count Orgaz's funeral in 1323, the saints Augustine and Stephen appeared to personally lower his body into the tomb as the Count's soul was seen ascending to heaven. So El Greco's painting sort of captures these events in this rather mannerist composition. The pictorial plane is sort of packed with these figures that recede into this rather ambiguous space. Actually, there's no true spatial setting here. We can see an angel kind of lifting Count Orgaz's soul up towards this glowing, otherworldly Christ at the apex of the composition, and this sort of represents a mystical heavenly vision above this earthly burial scene, which includes portraits of local aristocracy and religious nobles. We have the saints kind of here in the center, lowering the physical body of the Count towards his grave. And then the artist has actually included his 8-year-old son standing next to Saint Stephen, and he's signed his name on the little handkerchief that pokes out of his son's pocket here. And then this man that's sort of directly above Stephen's head here, he's the only other figure aside from the child who is looking directly out at the viewer. And so this is typically thought to be a self-portrait of the artist. So he's kind of incorporating and synthesizing this sense of humanism, or kind of this naturalistic depiction of earthly events, with this very kind of otherworldly mystical scene of divinity here.